Ishaan, thanks so much for joining me on an N of one. You have this episode is very special to me because you and I, in some ways, have very parallel stories, right? We have a lot of things in common, so I'm really excited to explore some of those.
Yeah, super thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. So look, I want to start in the traditional place. As you know, the point of an N of one is to emphasize that amid, the norms and the means and the medians and the modes that we tend to look at, all of these individual data points actually do matter. And your story really matters and can matter to somebody in behavioral science. And so, I want to go all the way back and I want to talk about like 7, 8-year-old Mr. Prinz. Like, who were you? What did you think you were going to do when you were 8?
Yeah, so when I was 7, I wasn't thinking too much about the career ahead of me. I spent a ton of time playing sports. That was really all I wanted to do. So I'd spend every spare minute either holding a tennis racket or kicking a football around or dressed like head to toe in cricket gear. So that was really my passion. My mom would take me to this tennis academy, which was about an hour away. And since the age of 3, I'd, just constantly be on the tennis court and I just loved it. So I guess in a sense, I saw myself becoming a professional tennis player one day. But outside of that, I think I was also intrigued by the business world. So I lived in Bangalore, India at the time, and my grandfather on my mom's side was a really successful businessman. And I remember even at that age, I would kind of watch how he conducted his meetings, how he met with employees, the advice he would give. And I was always kind of fascinated by that. It felt kind of magical to me. And I remember he, would tell me that running a good business isn't just about making a lot of money. It's also about treating employees well. And there's this one quote that I'll always remember, which is, be a good ape. So appreciate, praise, and encourage. And he had a ton of great behavioral principles that kind of have stuck with me.
That's amazing. So you were sort of, without knowing it, you were getting sort of the HR side of behavioral science, that internal behavior change early on. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
definitely.
What do you think you liked about sports? Like, why do you think that really like resonated for you?
I think it just came so natural to me. I just loved being active as a kid. I loved moving around. I thought it was a great way to make friends too. A lot of my best friends, even today, are friends I made through playing tennis or playing football. So I think it just has always been like a really nice source of joy for me and like just a really nice escape from like important real world things.
Hey, sports can be important in real world.
Yeah.
You're, in the Philly area, they take their sports very seriously.
That's true.
I came I'm from Oregon, and when I went to college there, I was just amazed because in Oregon we only have one pro sports team, right? The Blazers. And by and large, nobody really cares about them, right? Nobody knows how they're doing. Every once in a while you sort of like, oh, they made it to the championships. That's great. Philly, they care about everything, every
Oh, yeah.
sport. They're making up sports, arena football. Like that's not even a real sport, but they're like, yeah, we're going to be really serious about arena football. So yeah, sports matters. Was school a chore, or were you academically oriented at all, or was it sort of this is getting in the way of my sporting?
Yeah, a bit of both. So I would say I was a pretty good student. I was always very hardworking and diligent. I think my parents instilled in me like a pretty strong work ethic, but it was never like my number one priority. I always was more excited to spend lunches out kicking a ball around or something. But yeah, I would say I was always a pretty good student, never like exceptional.
And then you get a little older. Now you're a teenager. You're 13, 14. You're starting to get a little further into your studies. Was there a class that really stood out for you? Were you like a bio kid or a science kid or an English kid, or like was there a part of school that really started to resonate with you at some point?
Yeah, so I started school at UWC, and I know that you went to UWC yourself. I went to the Singapore campus, so that's where my family moved after we lived in India. And in UWC, we had to make a choice for what subjects to study in our IB program.
Hmm.
And I was set on my first 5 subjects. Those were pretty standard, like math and English and Spanish. And I had this one last wild card, and I decided to go with psychology kind of on a whim. It sounded really interesting, but at that point, I just thought, let me try something fun and something different. And I ended up really loving that class. My teacher, Sarah Carter, was so kind and so welcoming. Um, there were so many studies we learned about, and I still remember a couple of them, which really like influenced me and just like struck me as so powerful. And I think that's really where I kind of started to think about psychology as, something a bit more serious than just like this fun subject.
I love that you got into it for fun and stayed for the next, you stayed for the rest of your career. And the UWC is itself kind of a very psychological place. For listeners, the UWCs are the United World Colleges, are largely boarding schools around the world that are intended to bring together people from different countries. So, as an example, I went to the school in Hong Kong, which is the closest one to the one in Singapore, and it's about 250 kids from about 80 different countries. I mean, it's a very, very diverse environment, which is sort of a crash course in cross-cultural psychology because there are clashes. I mean, there are very real cultural sort of things that as teenagers you have to work out in an environment like that.
Totally.
And so, even if you're not taking psychology classes, you're taking psychology classes.
Right. I would
What
say
do you,
even,
go?
sorry, even within my home environment. So that was already like a microcosm of a multicultural environment for me. So my mom is Indian, my dad is German. I was actually born in the US in Boston, and then we moved to Singapore. So even at home, it was quite cool to kind of see these like rich cultural dynamics and just the unique points of view from each culture, but also some ways in which the two cultures were quite alike.
And as a teenager, as you're taking this psychology class, were you making that connection? Or was it, sort of there's psychology over here and there's what's going on over here, and it's only later that you sort of realized that they were maybe related?
I would say definitely in hindsight. So I think back then when I was taking psychology, I was just thinking about like, this is all so cool. So like I remember this one study we learned about, it was by Loftus and Palmer from I think 1974. It was a famous car crash experiment where the researchers asked participants like how fast was the car driving when it smashed into the car, and they asked other participants how fast was it driving when it hit the car, and they found that just by changing that verb, participants had completely different responses in terms of the speed and also their recollection of if they saw shattered glass or not. And I thought that was so cool. Like just the framing of a question can really impact how people like reconstruct their memory. And that was just my first glimpse into, wow, like the mind is so fascinating. But at that point, I never really connected it to my upbringing or my background.
And you also sort of mentioned that, your teacher was a big impact, that sort of the method of delivery of, that it was coming from this person that you liked and respected and was kind was an influence.
Absolutely. I think I would credit her as being the person who kept my passion in psychology alive and gave me kind of that confidence to continue taking it seriously. And it was just so helpful knowing that she had all this career advice. Like she would always tell me about possible careers in psychology.
Hmm.
And it was just very reassuring to get that advice from her, even though the actual options that she laid out weren't ones that I thought really fit my interests. So she spoke about clinical psychology and education, and none of that really resonated with me.
Yeah, so tell me about that. So you had seen your grandfather sort of run business, you've been interested sort of in the business thing, and then she comes along and says, "Oh, sort of what we might think of as one-on-one psychology, education, clinical psychology, where it's really dyadic and really sort of, you know, and you had just had the intuitive sense that wasn't really what you wanted to be doing."
Yeah, exactly. Um, you know, I kind of admired people who worked in that field, and thought it was important work, but it just didn't feel like the type of work I wanted to do myself. And I still felt in my core that there was a part of psychology that I would really love in an applied space. And I thought back then, like maybe it's advertising or marketing, without really knowing much about those fields either. So I kind of continued to trudge down this psychology path, hopeful and excited that there would be a good fit for me, just not knowing that a field like behavioral science even existed.
Well, but that's really perceptive for a young person to sort of, be able to see, hey, maybe there are these other adjacent fields that are sort of psychology like. And you did go on, and I mean, when you went to Haverford, was the plan psychology? I mean, were you like, I'm going to be a psych major day one? Because you were psych major, econ minor, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I did have that plan going into Haverford. So and I know you went to Swarthmore,
I
which
know we're adjacent. For those that don't know, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore are part of a consortium called the Tri-Colleges. And so, as you can tell, Ishaan is younger and more vibrant than I am. We did not
I
overlap.
know.
I'm a bit older than he is. But same sort of system. So you came in and you knew psych is the thing, and I'm going to go do this thing, and that's like a thing I want to pursue.
Exactly. So I think I built up so much interest in psych that I thought I have to kind of pursue it and really study it a little bit more seriously. And I loved it at Haverford. I was exposed to all these different branches of psychology, from clinical to the psychology of time to cultural psychology. But the area of psychology that I found most intriguing was personality psychology.
Hmm.
And my professor, Professor Lilgendal, was kind of one of these founding members of this new field called narrative identity, which is kind of the psychology of how we tell stories about ourselves and make meaning out of our past experiences, and how just by like reflecting on the past and the way in which we do that can be really predictive of our future outcomes. I thought that was super fascinating. So that's kind of where I really focused my time.
And so you go from this primary clinical exposure, right, to like, oh, hey, there's like all these other branches that I could potentially be getting involved in. Did you get involved in research while you were at Harvard?
I did a little bit, yeah. So one of the unique things about Haverford is that every senior has to write a thesis. And so as part of my thesis, I got to hop onto Professor Lilgendal's research. And she at that point was, recruiting thousands of college students to be part of her study. And what she would do is she would ask them about their academic high points and low points and get them to reflect on those experiences. And then she'd take those narratives and analyze the key themes that came out of them. So, when you're talking about a low point in the past, do you have healthy coping styles? Do you use growth themes, or do you tend to ruminate a little bit? And that, for example, can really predict your long-term well-being and levels of anxiety and things like that. So I was able to work really closely with her on that research and get like a little bit of a flavor of what what the academic side of psychology really looks like.
That's awesome. Uh, and so you do your senior thesis, you've done a little bit of research, you've got a peppering. If I had sort of caught you in college and said, well, what are you going to do after? Like, where did you think this was leading you?
Yeah. At that point, I think for a few reasons, consulting just felt like the path for me to go down. It was the path that I was most familiar with, and I had done a few consulting internships. One of them was in Hamburg, Germany, so it was really cool to work with an international team over there. Another one was in Singapore, and I got to work on the People and Change consulting team at a Big Four company. And that team really focused on, helping companies go through organizational change and how we can like facilitate change among companies, but also their employees, so that they're really prepared for like new ways of working. And I think in a sense, like now in hindsight, that really is very connected to behavioral science because, influencing people and managing change are all very difficult things to do. So I had a chance to get a bit of a flavor of that in some of my internships.
Yeah, and what you mentioned, I was most familiar with consulting, and it felt very. I mean, you sought out these internships. What was sort of cluing you in that maybe consulting was going to be a way that was going to be interesting to you?
Yeah, I think a part of it was just the availability of internship opportunities, candidly. So felt like consulting was something a lot of my friends were looking into. So it just felt like the path of least resistance. But one thing I did love about consulting when I tried it out was I'm this 19-year-old intern who gets to join my manager in these important meetings with these big decision makers at large companies, and just being able to like sit in those rooms, hearing what like a compliance director at the Singapore Central Bank had to say, or the head of like this multinational food corporation. Those were just that was just really eye-opening to me, and it felt cool to kind of be in those spaces and to be exposed to all these, influential people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and you're right, consulting is one of those places where you do get the most immediate exposure, right? Just because of the structure of the thing, you could get a lot of context very quickly. Uh,
Right.
Did you see at the time the sort of connection between what you were learning at school in psychology and sort of the people in change consulting that you were doing?
I think to some level, yes. So when I was studying personality psychology, I tried my best to apply that in the consulting space. And I think in some ways I was able to. So in that consulting role, we followed certain frameworks. So to help an employee go through change, you have to first make the change known, you have to make it clear, and then you have to make it stick. That kind of follows, like, now in hindsight, this behavioral science idea of awareness, engagement, and action and behavior change. So I did like that approach of solving problems. Sometimes I felt that the actual work was a little bit too heavily focused on the programmatic side, like managing these big programs, and less about the actual psychological level of behavior. So that was something that was a little bit missing.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think there's always this like hard operational bit of things that, uh, we it is easy to desire to sort of go as deep as you can on the sort of nasal gavy psychology philosophical part of it, but then at the end of the day, you have to get there's a change that has to happen. It has to get rolled out. There is a bunch of logistical stuff. And it's
Right.
hard when you're young to appreciate that, like, that stuff also has value because it's not sexy, right? It doesn't have this sort of like, to a college student, you're like, this feels very formulaic. But as you get older, you really start to appreciate that sort of layer of getting stuff done. And then, after you graduated, you then went back to KPMG and joined that same team. So clearly something in there kind of resonated for you.
Yeah, I I think I had some great mentors when I was at KPMG, and I thought this would be a great way for me to grow fast, get a lot of experience, work with all types of companies. But my long-term plan always from the start was this, like, knowing this isn't exactly where I see myself ending up. So
Say
uh,
more about that. As much as you were enjoying it, as much as it was interesting, what made you go, ooh, maybe this isn't going to be the long term thing?
yeah, I think again, I at that point, I think I didn't fully appreciate all the programmatic work that went into it, but I just thought that uh, my style of working has always been more creative and coming up with creative approaches to problem solving, and I I definitely had a chance to do that in consulting, but I wanted to go a little bit further than that,
Hmm.
and I kind of wanted to keep my options open and see what else was out there.
And then you ended up at Penn's, MBDS program. Tell me a little bit about like where that came into the like, hey, maybe I need more education here, or maybe the next step is more training.
Yeah, so I realized that while I was working in consulting, I would spend almost like every spare minute of my spare time going on these walks and just listening to behavioral science podcasts, I kind of came across them. There were a few that I loved, like the psychology podcast by Scott Barry Kaufman was really influential. He was a positive psychologist. I also remember following people like Amy Bucher, who was at MadPow at the time, Piyush Tantia at Ideas 42 and his team. And so I would just be listening to these people, and I was just so inspired and impressed by them. And I thought, like, this is my community. These are like my people. I'd love to be like them one day. And kind of the more I listened to them, the more I thought, okay, this is really what I want to do. Now it's just about how do I get there? And I thought a lot about different options. I didn't want to fully close out business school. I knew that would be a strong path as well. So I ended up applying to both a couple of business school programs and the MBDS program. And when I got into the MBDS program, it kind of felt like a no-brainer, kind of have to go down this path.
Yeah, and to your point, as much as people in change, can be a form of applied behavioral science, it hasn't attracted the me's and the Amy Bukers and the, Piyush's. We're all not working at KPMG, right? And so, uh, as you're listening to these exemplars who are maybe charting a little bit of a different path, and talk to me about going back to school. What did it feel like to be back in school? Did you think do you think you approached it differently than sort of your college education?
Yeah, so I think the timing, firstly, was very interesting. So this was in 2021, just as the pandemic was really slowing down. And the pandemic was a really tough time for a lot of people, but it was also really nice to be able to, you know, be in this very social environment again, um, after being locked down for so long. So um, I was really excited to go back to Philly, which is obviously where I did my undergrad. And I loved how I was able to, be around all these interesting people who all are aspiring behavioral scientists. Some of the close friends I made in the program, one of them worked at a large convenience store, helping them design, the layout of their shelves. Another good friend was the lead designer at a fasting digital, like a digital fasting company. Another friend, worked at a social media company, helping them boost engagement. So all thinking about those problems from a BeSci lens. So I was really excited to be there. Um, I took some great classes, Professor Demand's class in experimental methods was, I think, a really good foundation that I really needed at the time. And then you know, I kind of continued my networking while I was in the program. So just went on LinkedIn, searched behavioral scientist, clicked on everyone's profile who seemed interesting, and just reached out to a ton of people to kind of see what they actually did.
Yeah, and it's nice because by and large, applied behavioral science is a very friendly field, right? It's in that it's grown. I don't know that you can respond to every message that you get, but by and large, people are willing to give a little bit of their time, happy to sort of talk it through. And it was nice. It sounds like it was nice to be in an environment where maybe some other people also had that same sort of interest as you, where there was like an opportunity to be around people where behavioral science felt like maybe a bigger part of what they were interested in doing in the world.
Yeah, for sure. It was cool because it just felt like my whole life I was obviously around all these smart, interesting people, but I'd never felt like I was around someone who wanted to do what I did. And now just being around so many people with common interests was such a cool moment.
Yeah. No, I can totally understand that. Were there, you mentioned experimental methods, which of course is such a, so when I go and talk to companies, they have lots of problems, right?
Mhm.
As we well know, like applied behavioral science is not particularly well applied quite yet. But the thing that a lot of companies these days realize is they're not pretty good at experiments. Most people will sort of say, yeah, we just don't know how to run a pilot. And so less that we don't think it's interesting. It's not a promoting pressure problem, but rather we just like literally don't know how to do it. We don't have any of the mechanization. And so we just don't end up running them. So experimental methods classes just become so important in the workplace as you sort of start to spread things out. And you were also doing stuff with behavioralize, uh, and getting some experience out in the field. Talk to me about like how you ended up doing that and what that felt like for you.
Yeah, so one of the people I ended up reaching out to in my first year at MBDS was Jason Reese, who's the founder of Behavioralize, and as was a marketing professor at Wharton. And I wanted to just learn more about what his team did, and he mentioned that they'd be open to some part-time support. And I realized that, this might be something, might be a great way for me to kind of dip my toes into applied behavioral science while I'm still in the program. So I ended up joining them part-time. I worked with Jason really closely, as well as Jared Peterson, who I know is a friend and has been on the podcast.
Yep.
And I was just so fascinated by the work, but Jared specifically was such a great mentor. I think one thing he taught me was that behavioral science is so much more than just a set of nudges and biases. Like there's so much nuanced work going on. And I know he works at Nuance now, so that's maybe the right term. But he, kind of taught me the importance of critical thinking in behavioral science, that, there's so many open debates and it's good to have those debates. And yeah, I think that was a great way for me to, kind of soft launch my career in behavioral science.
Yeah, and, to your point, because of the sort of academic tradition of applied behavioral science, it's a little bit easier for everyone to participate in that discourse in the way that, like, if you're at a big four consulting company, the partner's opinion beats your opinion, right? It's, they have the high cards, you have the low cards. But sort of in behavioral science, it is a much more, it's not always that way, but it can be a much more egalitarian field just because of its sort of academic roots. And you came from consulting, so probably I could see ways in which behavioralized was sort of had some overlap. But then you kind of took an interesting turn, right? As you come out of MBDS, you end up, in a role that's not a consulting role, right? So sort of, in the perfectly linear, logical version of this thing, right? You like go to KPMG and then you go to MBDS and then you go back to like, Irrational Labs or one of the, Behavioralize or, one of the consulting places to sort of do that work. But you end up at an in-house role. Had you been looking for in-house as the sort of place direction you wanted to go? Was that happenstance? Like, tell me about coming to Vanguard and sort of how that happened.
Yeah, so I was at that point, I was very open to the type of company and the industry that I'd like to work in. I definitely had Vanguard on my radar. I also had other large companies on my radar, and then also some think tanks and consulting firms like IDS 42 and the Behavioral Insights team and so on. So kind of any possible organization. But one thing that was really important to me was that the company had a really good product and had like a strong mission statement and good values, and was like well respected by its customers. So Vanguard ended up kind of like ticking all those boxes. I obviously had heard a lot about Vanguard before. I had friends who were customers at Vanguard and spoke highly about the products and the experience. So I think that was like an early green flag. But it was only after I really like spoke with some of the behavioral scientists on their team, just when I was still in that stage of networking, I learned more about the work they did and was just really impressed. So I spoke with two behavioral scientists, and they were both just so kind, so nice, but at the same time professional and clearly very bright. And I was kind of intrigued by the work. It felt like, it was exciting to know that there was a team of behavioral scientists out there that was, pretty large and established, relatively speaking. So it felt like a nice place for someone like me who was relatively newer to the space to really get a lot of like support and good way for me to grow rather than doing it all on my own.
Yeah, and well, and what a gift, right? So many
Yeah.
there just aren't that many large established behavioral science teams. So many people are, we hear time and time again from young people, man, what I really want is to work with another behavioral scientist, right? Like I want to work with a Matt Wallet, I want to work with an Ishaan, I want to work with an Amy, I want to work with somebody who's been there. But there just aren't that many opportunities. Often you're the behavioral scientist, singular, and you fit in across a cross-disciplinary team. What was it? What about as you started to have conversations with them, stuck out at you as like, hey, this might be an environment I want to work in?
Yeah, a couple of things. So I think firstly, I was excited by the fact that the behavioral scientists on the team had like a wide range of backgrounds.
Mhm.
So a few behavioral scientists went down the academic path, had gotten their PhDs in different fields. So political philosophy, advertising, statistics. Others like Jackie, who's now my manager, studied public policy. Um, Haley, did her eventually got her degree as well at MBDS. So it was kind of cool to see like a mix of people coming from that very academic path, as well as some with more of a consulting background.
Mhm.
And that kind of made me feel like I could be a good fit. So given my experience in consulting and recent experience in the MBDS program, it felt like a nice way for me to possibly like apply both sets of skills.
Yeah, I mean, earlier you talked about having the sense as you were listening to Amy and Piyush and other people on podcasts and things, you were like, these are my people. It sounds like a little what I'm hearing is, when you talk to the Vanguard, there was that sense of like, oh, these are my people, right? Like these are, at the intersection of the things where I have experience and have interest and have energy.
Definitely. And I think I really felt that in one of my first interviews with their team. So I think the interview structure was unique because all the behavioral scientists joined the call and was more like a discussion. And at first that was a little intimidating. But then it ended up being really fun because it almost felt like a normal team meeting where we were like bouncing ideas back and forth. And they were being quite tough in a good way, like challenging my ideas, but also bouncing off on the ideas. And in that moment, I just kind of felt like this is the type of Teams call I'd like to have on a regular basis. Like it's so fun and it's nice to work with like smart but also kind people. So I got like a nice flavor for what work could be like.
Yeah, it was like a good date. You were like, oh,
Yeah,
I'd like to do this again. This felt good.
exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a wonderful and lovely sort of feeling to go into as you go into a job. And do you feel like that's largely borne out? The impression that you got at the beginning is very similar to sort of the actual experience of working there.
Oh yeah, completely. It's been honestly such an amazing experience. Like I truly feel like it's been my dream job. Like this was meant to be my dream job, so it really feels like the right place for me right now. And I think Vanguard is also a great place to work. It's such a huge company, so one thing I felt a bit overwhelmed by when I started was um, it almost feels like you're moving to New York without knowing anyone. Like, who do I speak to? Who do I go to for help? Beyond like my immediate team. So I know other people at Vanguard have been there for 5 years and they still say they're kind of like getting the ropes and like figuring things out. But now that I've been there for about 3 years, I think that also is quite exciting. It's almost like being on a Wikipedia page and knowing you have all these sub pages you still have to read, but it makes it also really fun to know that, it's this like really impressive, intricate organization and there's always more to learn.
Well, and as an organization, even within its space, right? Vanguard is a very particular kind of investment vehicle as compared to say Fidelity or Schwab or one of the others. It's a very pioneers of the ETF, pioneers of the sort of like, hey, good enough is good enough version of investing. Um,
Sorry about
no,
that.
not at all. We get a little dance music. I like this. We're doing good. Um, uh, and it also had the benefit of you have spent a tremendous amount of your career in and around Philly. You sort of, I know you went back to Singapore to do KPMG, but like, you went to college there, you went to grad school there, you now are at Vanguard there, your behavioralized was there. What do you think it is about Philly that kind of keeps you so attracted to the region?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And people are sometimes surprised when I tell them Philly is one of my favorite cities. They often think I'm being sarcastic, but I think it's such an
Philly is a
amazing city.
sleeper hit. I don't know what you're talking about. I think Philly's great. I would love to live in Philly.
It's great. I mean, it's more affordable than cities like New York and Boston. It has so much character and culture. The restaurant scene is really underrated, I would say, and some of the best food I've had is in Philly. And there's obviously a great art scene. So I think all of those things have kept me here. I think also just the fact that I have some friends from the MBDS program, either in Philly or in New York. So some of them are trying to convince me to move, but I'm pretty happy here for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of great things to do. Um, and it sounds like for right now, this really feels, you've been there almost 3 years, so you sort of are in your second tour of duty, right? You did 2 years and you decided to do it again. Um, do you still feel like you're learning and growing?
For sure. Yeah, I kind of feel like you kind of move between gears as you like grow your career in behavioral science. So I would say my first year was really about like getting my footing in the experiments I was running, making sure I was running the experiments really well. The second year was more about building up those stakeholder management skills, and that was, a really challenging part of the job. As I'm sure you know, and I know a lot of the guests on your show have spoken about this, but the challenge of, working really well with partners and actually bringing your ideas to life. And often you can have a great idea that ends up sitting on the shelf for a few years. So kind of navigating that. And I think now in my third/fourth year, it's kind of like bringing it all together and not just doing these individual studies, but moving beyond that to kind of do these bigger programs of work and having like longer term impact. So it feels like there are always more studies to be done and more research programs to be created. And that can also feel overwhelming, but it's about really like finding a good balance between the quick wins, bigger projects.
Yeah, I was lecturing at Columbia the other day, and one of the things I always tell the students is like, it's relatively easy to find things that work. It's
Mhm.
relatively hard to find things that are worth scaling, right? That work at a cost benefit ratio. But I don't think people necessarily have that a priori assumption. I mean, I think a lot of people think you're just going to have failure after failure. And actually, a lot of things work. And the bigger problem is figuring out, okay, great, of the things that worked, which should we actually do, right?
Right.
Um, because, psychology has gotten to a point where obviously humans are still largely a mystery to us, but we understand enough that you can usually confidently get to some sort of design that will have some sort of impact, right? The question is just, can you make it big enough that it really makes sense for a business to? I think there's also a perception when you're a junior behavioral scientist that, like, as any positive ROI is good. And
Mhm.
that's true, but it doesn't, if you're not seeing 10% gains, we're probably not going to implement that unless it's very, very easy to do, right?
Right.
And things are deceptively hard. You're like, oh, how hard can it be to change the language on the Vanguard website? And you're like, well, you got to change it in 26 languages and you got to change it on 133 pages and it has to be approved by the lawyers and. It's a lot harder than you think it is. Um,
Right. I've definitely gotten a good appreciation for that. So I've also, I think, developed like the skill of like patience, where, sometimes you have a great idea, but it's just not the right time for it. And I've only been at Vanguard 3 years, but I know other behavioral scientists have spoken about how they had a great idea 5 years ago, just wasn't the best time for the business to implement it, just didn't fit with the roadmap. But then 5 years later, they came back and said, hey, this is like on one of the cover page, on one of the front pages of the site. So it is nice to get that reassurance that like, sometimes good ideas will eventually come to life.
That's awesome. And what a lovely perspective. And, part of so many behavioral science careers is patience, right? You sort of think you're not going to make it. You come into the job market at a bad time, or, you can't find quite the right thing. And it's very easy to convince yourself that it's about you. But to your point, so often it's just timing, right? Like the market's not in the right place, the company's not in the right place to be able to implement that. But it doesn't mean it's not a good idea, and it doesn't mean we won't eventually do it.
Right.
A really great reminder.
And
But
I think also one thing I learned was, sometimes I can feel really confident that, what I've tested is the right way forward for the company, but then there's so many different things to think about. There's the corporate strategy, there's a bunch of different considerations, how can we be compliant from a regulatory standpoint? And I think it's also kind of humbling to know that yes, in isolation, this could work great, but maybe I need to learn more about how the company actually works to see if this actually is what we should be doing. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think often people think of applied behavioral sciences as making decisions, and more often we are either collectively making a decision or empowering the decision that someone, I'm trying to provide the evidence that allows someone else to make a trade-off using metrics that I may not even be aware of, right? I don't know what our macro strategy is, so there may be perfectly valid reasons to not scale this intervention at this moment that I just don't have visibility into because that's not where I sit in the organization, or that's not really my job as an applied behavioral scientist to have that sort of 360 view.
Totally.
Which I think can actually be quite lovely. We're going to do a special edition. We do this mostly the stories, but we do a few special editions on an N of one, and I think we're going to do one about the behavioral science executive coming up. And the sort of there's a rarefied few people who have done great things in applied behavioral science, but their jobs have mainly been as executives, right? I manage 500 people, right? Like this much of my job is applied behavioral science. This much of my job is managing 500 people, right? And so there is this interesting, what is this stack that behavioral science needs to learn and spread and do and show in the world that shows people that, hey, there is a translation between these two things.
Right.
What a great career you've had so far, right? I mean, you've had so many great experiences, and I'm so excited to see what comes next for you as you continue to grow, as you continue to mature in the field. And thank you so much for coming and sharing your story with us, because I do think, you've had such a lovely and interesting experience, and I love the idea. Part of being a scientist is counterfactual thinking. So I love to think that somewhere out there's the universe where you're back at KPMG and you went down more of a human behavior change in the sort of like change management sort of version, and that also was a possibility in the world, even if it's not the one that actually we've chosen to manifest in this particular universe.
Yeah, you never know. But thank you. It was awesome to meet you in person, and really was great speaking with you. And I love the podcast. I'm excited to see your future episodes.
Well, yours soon, coming up next. Thank you for sharing your story on an N of one.
Yeah, thank you for the time.